I understand that, so I will certainly, let me bring that closer, that way. So this is more of a class based on what the records that scientists and doctors and researchers have found. This is not an attempt to prove or disprove the Bible. This is not an attempt to besmirch or to put a disdain on what we learn in our faith. And we understand that faith is not about seeing or hearing. Faith is about believing. So there is a big difference in what we do here on a Sunday morning and what the topic that we're going to be talking about reflects. There are going to be some challenges. I'm not going to dissuade people from that. And I welcome questions and concerns. But again, we live in a world where, I don't want to say a polarized world. We live in a world where there are multiple views. And one of those views is faith, which is why we gather together on Sunday mornings. But one of those other views is what can we see with our own eyes? What do the things that we find on the ground or in the ground tell us about what we know and what we can know? Because as much we read in the Gospels that Jesus spoke after his resurrection, and the Gospel writers write that there was so much information that it would have taken forever for people to have written that stuff down. So we don't have a complete record. If the Gospel writers could not, in my perspective, the Gospel writers can only summarize that information by saying that brief, or writing that brief amount of information. What more do we need to learn, or what more can we learn from what we see and what we find? Especially given, as we're going to start, in Judea, okay? This is more than 2,500 years ago, more than almost 3,000 years ago. The purpose of today's class, this first class, is going to give you a basis of what researchers, archaeologists, historians, what they do, and how they do it, and why they do it. We'll jump into some information that might be recognizable, but there may be some information that is not recognizable or just not well known. Does anybody here have done any independent research, reading, information, gathering about the historical record, about the history of Judah? Okay, that's fine. That's kind of the whole point of this class. So one of the terms that I'm going to be using is Judah. I'm not going to call it Israel. If I talk about Israel, then I'm either misspeaking or I'm talking about a different topic. Because, yes, ma'am. Correct. So, in the historical record, there are actually, we know of the 12 tribes, but there are two kingdoms. There are the kingdoms of Israel, which falls in the mid 6th century to the Assyrians, and you have the diaspora, and those are the northern kingdoms. And then you have the kingdom of Judah and Benjamin, and there are a small portions of some of the other southern kingdoms that make up the kingdom of Judah. Okay? That's where we get the word Jew from. The word Jew, and this goes to the terminology that I'm going to be talking about, the word Jew in the historical record, in the historical and archaeological context, specifies when you are talking to a historian or archaeologist. If you are talking to somebody and you mention a Jew, the foundational, the definition or the foundation of that word is a Judahite. They are of the southern kingdom. Okay? What this class is not really is going to, and what part of today's class is going to summarize the pre-exilic world of the Levant. Okay, and then we'll define the Levant in a second as well. So we're going to talk about roughly from 2000 BCE to the 500s today. We're just going to get a really quick summary about how we end up where we're going to be going to. So let's talk about what is anthropology. So fundamentally, anthropology is comprised of 4 disciplines. There's the physical, which talks about the physical attributes of humans. There's the cultural, which is a large portion of what we're going to talk about. Linguistic, which is really, really important because there are some notions that we're going to have to dispel, such as writing and reading and literacy in the ancient world. It wasn't pronounced. If you read throughout the Old Testament, you read of the scribes. Well, there's a reason that a scribe was important. It wasn't because Brother Joe or Sister Susan could write a letter. It's because not even the kings really generally were literate. Not even the temple persons. The Levites, for most, the assistants, not necessarily the Levites or the priests. That was part of their learning. But it's important to understand how linguistics gets us to what we can know. This is really about what we can know. Can we know, for example, where's the ark? We don't know. We can't know because we haven't found it. And the record that we do have, the Old Testament, is silent. What we know is that at the return of Judah in the 500s, there is no listing of the Ark of the Covenant. Where has it gone? Why has its importance gone away? We're going to talk about the 400 years missing in the record. It's not really missing. It's just something that the people who gathered the documents together that comprised the Testament just didn't include it. You got 1st and 2nd Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Esdras, which are considered extra-canonical documents. But there's still documents that record history. We just don't have them in what we consider our scriptures. And then you have the archaeological. And the archaeological is the physical buildings, lots and lots of pottery shards and pottery, which tells us a whole bunch of stuff. Buildings, excavations, fire placements, old drawings, things like that. That's archaeology. Anthropology is only a tool, such as history, and history is part of our anthropology. I just didn't include it. These are the 4 main fields of anthropology. The historical record is very limited. Currently in the Levant, we only have about 2% of any record that we can relate to what we find in the Old Testament. Okay? So 2% they've been digging for. Really, the field began about 150 years ago. And we've only excavated 2%. A large portion of that is because people don't want to dig in holy sites. And there's a very big, there's just too much violence associated with those kind of areas. You may hear me say Near Eastern studies or Oriental studies. These are other terms for studying the biblical narrative and the biblical areas. Near Eastern, because that is what it was called for the longest time, still is in many scholarly writings and so forth. So biblical archaeology is the study of the material culture of the ancient Near East. When I say material culture, that's the archaeology, that's the limited writings that we have, the societies, and what we can learn from that. Specifically, the region of the events noted in the Bible, and to understand the historical and cultural context of the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament. It uses methods from archaeology, history, and anthropology to examine artifacts, sites, inscriptions, and other physical evidence to shed light on the social, religious, and economic lives of the peoples who lived in the region. While early practitioners, and I'm going to try to introduce the names of some, throughout this class, of scholars, biblical scholars. They are not necessarily religious folk. Does not necessarily mean they are agnostics or atheists. In fact, roughly 80% of all researchers have some sort of religious association. They do not, they are believers of some God in some form that we would recognize as either Hebrew or Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. The early practitioners sought to prove the biblical accounts. Most modern scholars now have a more nuanced approach. They are trying to explore how archaeology can support, challenge, or simply provide a context for biblical narratives. Why do we talk about Jericho and the walls falling down? Why do we talk about the Second Temple period? Because those are reflected in our Bibles. And currently, only about 2% of sites that are mentioned, again, in the Bible have been located and excavated to some point. Doesn't mean that they're fully excavated, but that there's excavation ongoing or has gone on in the past. Core aspects of biblical archaeology. They focus on the material evidence. And most of this material evidence is not focused on the Bible itself. The Bible is a reference. The Old Testament is a reference in this situation, but it only provides direction and a foundation to what they're looking for. The Mount of Olives, the room that Jesus held the Last Supper. Those are sites those are foundational. We know of them in the Bible. So let's see what we can find. Which room was it? Which building was it? Which road was it? You get into the 3rd, 4th century CE, you talk about, the true cross. Helena, the mother of Constantine the First, supposedly 300 and some years later finds the true cross. Well, let's see what we can prove. Let's see what we can find. Those are material aspects. Pottery, buildings, tools, inscriptions to reconstruct the past and the daily lives of people who lived in biblical times. A lot of this is research about the daily lives of the regular Jew. What did Josiah, not Josiah the king, Josiah the guy who owns the 3 goats in the next village over, what does he do on a regular day? This is a lot of what archaeologists and anthropologists and historians are trying to identify. Because we have the great scholarly and priestly works and priestly understandings, because we have them written down. But what did Joe Schmo do? How was his life? Did he really go to the temple every year? How did he, if he could barely afford to feed himself and his family every year, how was he able to do that? How did he maintain a calendar? How did he know when was the appropriate time to do so? These are things and questions that archaeologists and anthropologists and historians ask often. And that's what they're really trying to find out, oftentimes. I will say this with a grain of salt. There are people out there who are attempting to disprove the Bible. Most of those people are not recognized as scholarly or have authority in the circles of educators. Because educators, those of you who are teachers or who have people who are teachers or former teachers, know that an educator is not trying to prove or disprove something. They're trying to pass on information. That's really what they're trying to do. It's the information that they have. The geographic scope, and we're going to talk about that today, primarily covers the Middle East and the Mediterranean world, with a specific focus on the land of the Bible, modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, also known as the Levant. And I will have a map up in a second to define that. Interdisciplinary approach. So they use various fields: archaeology, ancient history, epigraphy, I always mess that word up, which is the study of ancient scriptures and ancient writings, and anthropology. But there's also medical doctors who research bones and understand the diets and the daily ongoings of the daily people who lived in this land. And then historical context. So you have a good foundation with the Bible, but let's verify this information. Was there a flood? I'm not talking about the flood because we're not covering that area of the Bible in this class, but was there a weather event, a flood? Was there an earthquake? Was there a drought? How can we verify this information? How can we not verify this information? We're not trying to prove the negative. We're just trying to understand the context and the relationship with the biblical text. That's really, some scholars are trying to find evidence to support biblical accounts. Others are using a more critical approach to see how the findings compare to and interact with the text, which can sometimes be a challenge or contradict the narratives. Because the reality is, most of these texts that we have were not written at the time that they purport to have been written. Most of these writings occurred afterwards. Ezra, we know that happened because a guy named Ezra in the Babylonian records did live, but he lived 50 years after the return of Israel, or the return of Judah to Jerusalem. So Ezra could not have written Ezra contemporaneously at the same time that he was experiencing it, because the record that we have reflects that he didn't live until 50 years later. Now, that doesn't mean that what he's writing is incorrect. It is merely saying that his writing was not contemporaneous with the events that are recorded in his writings, in the narrative. Some key examples of discoveries and sites, and this is just a mere simple 3-point example. This Dead Sea Scrolls, also known as the Qumran writings. The Qumran group was a group of Jews who got tired of the way the temple was being maintained at their time, which is the late 1st, 2nd century, beginning 1st and 2nd century BCE. And they kept meticulous records that only the last 80 years have we been able to understand. Hezekiah's tunnel was discovered and confirmed. This is the tunnel that runs from, it's also known as the Siloam Tunnel. It runs from the spring outside of Jerusalem into the walled city. That was discovered about 65, 70 years ago. The Tel Dan Stele, one of the most important archaeological finds, because a stele is basically a giant rock with a historical narrative put into it. This one is specific because it is one of the few archaeological discoveries that mentions the house of David. It is currently dated from 870 BCE to 750 BCE. We have very few, outside of the Bible, very few archaeological records to indicate that there was a king named David. However, the Tel Dan Stele is one of those few records that does indicate that there was a person named David and that he was a king in the Levant, or the Canaanite region. Yes, ma'am. I will certainly print it out. I apologize. There's a ton of information, and I didn't want to. It's already like 40 slides, and I didn't want to make it any longer for today, because I'm not sure I'm going to get through this today. So modern approaches. We talked about this, moving beyond proof. This is not necessarily an attempt to prove. Early archaeologists were attempting to prove the Bible, to show, look, this is true, this is true, this is true. We are more modern scholars. I'm not going to say me. Modern scholars are more interested in using archaeology to understand the complexities of the ancient world described in the text and the social aspects of them, how people lived. Anthropological perspectives, many scholars are using the anthropological methods that we're going to discuss today to explore broader social historical questions that have little to do with proving specific biblical stories. For example, what happened between the fall or the return of Judah and the rise of Rome? The biblical narrative does not talk about anything like that, but we know from the historical record and the archaeological record that those 400 years aren't missing. There's some very specific events that occurred. And we have evidence of that. That's outside of the Bible that is useful for interpreting the Bible. An aside here, a personal aside. This is what really got me interested in biblical archaeology and biblical history. I wanted to know what Jesus lived and what his society was like. Because, for example, we interpret the Greek word for Jesus' occupation as carpenter. But that's not what the actual Greek word means. The Greek word just means day laborer. He could have been a carpenter. He could have been a stonemason. He could have been a number of things, because he learned that from his earthly father, Joseph. But what did a day laborer do? What did a carpenter do? What were they building? What does a Jewish person living in the outskirts of a very small town do on a daily basis? Because we only have 3 years of his life at the most. What was, when he went to the festivals, when he went to the temple, what was the daily ritual? Because the rituals that occur in what we're going to talk about for these first few weeks are not the same rituals that we're going to be talking about weeks down the road around the Roman period. Let me ask you this. The high priest of Israel in the time of Jesus, what is his priestly line? Does he derive from Aaron? It's not necessarily, it's no. He is not of the priestly line, which if you read in the Torah, is required to be the high priest. Because things happened that caused the priestly line to go away in the 2nd century BCE. The Hasmoneans rise, they get rid of the temple practice as it was at that time. And the second temple period, those priestly roles are different than the roles of the first temple priests, because the events and the circumstances that they were in were different at that time. You go from an agricultural society to a more city-based society. The temple practice, when they were living in tents, and the temple was in the tent. That's why I mentioned the Ark of the Covenant, because the focus in the first temple and the focus of the tent meeting was the Ark of the Covenant. But you no longer have the Ark. You still have the Holy of Holies, but you no longer have an Ark, which is what? The footstool of Adonai. So, we're going to start off with two important anthropological persons. William Flinders Petrie, he is a British archaeologist. He's considered the father of Palestinian and Egyptian archaeology because there was really no biblical archaeology at this time. The mid-late 1800s, he developed what we call stratigraphy, which is learning how to distinguish the different layers. So we know that the oldest layer is going to be at the bottom because that's where you start. It's like when if you dug up these roads, you'd see a little bit of different layer type of road underneath it until you get to the dirt, to the old dirt paths, right? It's kind of the same thing. What kind of pottery, what kind of fire remnants, what kind of food or bone remnants do you find in this layer? Are they different from the layer underneath it or the layer above it? So these are things that Dr. Petrie really developed. I think my personal viewpoint is these thoughts were there beforehand. They just weren't written down and studied as part of the study itself. Then you have Dr. William Foxwell Albright. He is an American archaeologist. He really is the considered the father of modern biblical archaeology. He developed a lot of the techniques. He refined a lot of the techniques that came to be and are used today to study the Bible. He was the first to publicly recognize that the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran writings, were authentic and that they dated back to the 1st and 2nd century BCE. He was very influential in biblical archaeology. Some common terms that I'm going to go through. BCE, before the Common Era. As archaeologists, as practitioners, they do not use the biblical terms BC, before Christ, AD, Anno Domini. He used before the Common Era and the Common Era. Those are the terms I'm going to use, just so that we're clear. A tell. What is a tell? It's not, we all know what a tell is. That's when you're playing poker and you can tell what somebody's doing. But a tell is a mound. So we have burial mounds all throughout this area. Those are tells. Generally, a tell is considered a village or a community. It is just the buildup of the different layers. That's where you get the stratigraphy from. So you tell the Tel Dan Stele. It's called the Tel Dan Stele because that stele was found at the Tel Dan, which is in the northern kingdom. Okay? Did you have a question, Grant? No. Okay. Jewish, I talked about this. We're going to use the word Jewish to denote the kingdom of Judah and Benjamin. The Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Persians, called this area Yehud, which is where we get the word Judah. It's actually a very common word. So if you see the word Yehud, I know half of you can't see because I can't see it half the time either, but Yehud, if you see that word, it's denoting Judah. Okay, it's the same kingdom. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. Those of you who speak a foreign language or even know a little bit about a foreign language know that that is an incomplete and inaccurate translation. You cannot describe one word from one language to another 100%. There's always going to be some errors. The review of many of the people who do linguistics and who do the writing, study that stuff, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some of the mistranslations and just the incomplete conception of what the Hebrew word may mean. Adonai, Y-H-W-Y, W-H. It's called the Tetragrammaton. It is pronounced in English, and it comes from the Greek Yahweh as a sign of respect to those who do practice Judaism. I do not generally pronounce that word. The biggest substitution for that word is Adonai, which means Lord. So if you read in your Old Testament or you read the New Testament and you see the word Lord, just know that 99% of the time that word is actually in the original text, Yahweh. The other reason for that is we don't know how to pronounce it. We think that that's how you pronounce it. But if you note, Hebrew doesn't have vowels. And it became such a holy word that by the 2nd century BCE, people didn't pronounce it. They said Adonai. And people actually forgot how to originally pronounce it. And we don't have any reference to actually know how it sounded 100%. So another reason most scholars do not use the word or do not actually pronounce the word. They may spell it, or you'll see the word Adonai in substitution. Okay, so this is the Levant. I wish I had a pointer. The orange section is considered typically the Levant. Composes portions of modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. The area we are going to study is typically associated and called the Southern Levant, which is the Kingdom of Judah and portions of Egypt, also portions of modern-day Jordan. If you can see, there's a section right there at the very top right, to my right, that is yellow. That extends further over, hits the Euphrates, and goes down to the Red Sea. That yellow portion, along with that orange portion, and actually further into Egypt, is what is historically known as the Fertile Crescent. So the Levant was a portion of the Fertile Crescent, but it was not the entire Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent was not the Levant. It encompassed much, much more. We'll learn and we'll see these things further down the road that almost everything that we know about and almost all the societies that are relevant, the major cities, the major locations are all going to be around water. Doesn't mean that there's going to be annual flooding and so forth, but water is vital in this area. So you have the rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, goes to the eastern Mediterranean, extends down into Upper and Lower Egypt. And those of you who don't know, Upper Egypt is considered Central Africa. Lower Egypt is considered the portion up by the Mediterranean, because the Nile River flows from the top to the bottom. I know that looks weird, sounds weird, but it flows from Central Africa up to the Mediterranean. So the portion where it starts is Upper Egypt, and Lower Egypt. No, I've got that backwards. It's not relevant at this point because I'm confusing myself right now. And I'm looking at the clock and my ADHD is kicking in. Yes, ma'am. Levant is just a term for the region. There is, I don't know what it means off the top of my head. I will certainly find that out and bring that to everybody next week. I know nobody can read this. I can barely read it, Canaan, another geographical term. What is Canaan? Canaan really isn't a geographical term. It's actually a societal term. It represents the people that lived in the Levant. They were called Canaanites. So that's where we get the land of Canaan. It's not the land of Canaan, it's the land of the Canaanites. But modern linguistics has moved it over to Canaan. Although used as a location, it's actually an ancient Semitic-speaking civilization associated with the region of southern Levant. This is just a picture of Canaanite artwork. The Canaanites, this is a transport of Lebanese cedar. It is from the north wall of the main court of the King Sargon III's palace in Dur-Surakim in Assyria. Assyria is modern-day Syria. Assyria is considered modern-day Syria now. In Khorsabad, Iraq, so near the Syrian border. This is from the Louvre. It wasn't stolen along with the jewels, unfortunately. One of the other things is Canaanites are, anybody know who the Phoenicians are? I've heard the word of the Phoenicians. Okay. The Phoenicians is the Greek word for Canaanites. Canaanites are not one group that just lived in the Levant. They ended up being all around the Mediterranean. They were seafaring people. That's actually what Phoenicia means in Greek. So, real brief, a timeline of relevant Jewish history, and we're going to go through this in detail. This is relevant history to our class, not relevant history overall. So starting about 600 BCE, you have the fall of Jerusalem in 589 to 587 to the Neo-Babylonian Empire and beginning the exile. Not everybody was taken to Babylon or Assyria. Many fled to Egypt or to other portions of the Mediterranean. And then when the return to Israel, or return to Jerusalem, most didn't come back. Most stayed outside, which is why 500, 400 years later, in the writings of the New Testament, you have the writers of Acts and Paul writing to other churches throughout, because these churches aren't Gentile churches. In the first century, in the 50s and 60s, these are some form of Jewish followers who he is writing to. There's very few Gentiles who have incorporated. And we'll get into that history and so forth. Promise. The Persian period, 538 to roughly 333. This is when the Persians, who are Iranians nowadays, the Persian kingdom takes over. They destroy Babylon, the Edict of Cyrus, and we'll talk about that. That's 538, the first return from exile. There are multiple returns, by the way. So you have Ezra during the first return. You have Nehemiah, who comes a couple years later. And you have subsequent returns to Jerusalem. This is, if you read Ezra, and this is mentioned multiple times in Ezra and in Chronicles. Chronicles is also written post-exile. Chronicles is a revision of the Book of Kings, and up until about the 1500s modern era, CE, it was one book. It still is one book in most Jewish Old Testaments. Same with Kings. It is one book. We separate it to two books because it just is easier for people to read that way. But the Cyrus cylinder, which is the denotion of return the people to their original places of land, that Cyrus cylinder does not mention Jerusalem, but it is mentioned in Ezra and in Chronicles. And I will write that. Ezra 1, 1 through 4, 6, 1 through 12, and 2 Chronicles 36 through 22 through 23. okay? It mentions the Cyrus cylinder. Now, is this the only Cyrus cylinder? It's the only one we have. Doesn't mean that there wasn't a second one that does mention Jerusalem, but the one we do have does not mention it. So 520 to 515, you have the beginning of the building of the Second Temple. If you read in Ezra, there's only a foundation built. There's not much of the building built. 520 BCE, you have Haggai, and he is writing post-exile. In 500 BCE, there is a large development of the notion of a Messiah. Who is the Messiah in the Old Testament? Anybody? In 2 Chronicles, the writer of 2 Chronicles calls Cyrus, the Persian king, God's anointed one, and Messiah. He is the only person outside of a Jewish person to be called the Messiah in the Bible. That shocked me when I read that the first time a couple of years ago. Blew me away. Did it mean the same thing? We don't know. It's one of the things we're trying to figure out. Culturally, what did that mean? Did it have the same definition that we understood it to be 400 years later when Jesus is called the Messiah? Or 200 years later during the Dead Sea Scrolls writing? Yes. He let them come back. He was God's anointed one because he was the tool that God used to free the Jews. That's the understanding of why he is called that. And I looked, almost every modern Bible nowadays translates the word as anointed one. Anointed one in Hebrew, High Hebrew, which is a different form of Hebrew than we have today, though it means the same thing, is Messiah, where we get the word Messiah. I will come back to this timeline because we're running a little bit short. There's a couple things I do want to cover today. But this, and I will have this printed. I've got access to a nice printer at work. I will print out a bunch of copies so that people can have this information, especially this timeline. So this is kind of just an overview of the timeline. We're going to talk about, the Reformation led by Ezra and Nehemiah, the Torah, the development of the actual scripture itself, because if you read in Ezra, the people were amazed because they hadn't heard of the book of Moses. So the organization of the Torah, I'm going to talk about a couple of kings of Persia. We're going to talk about Haman and Esther and Purim, some of the celebrations that the Jews have and had. The Megillah, which I put in there, that's it's kind of a holy reading, a grouping of some of the books that they read during Purim. Then we're going to get into 330 BC to 69 AD, the Hellenistic period. Alexander the Great comes in, he conquers Israel. Judaism, or Judah, goes under the Greeks and the Seleucids. Seleucids are the Egyptians, who are Greek vassals. So they are Hellenistic Egyptians. Around 250, the Septuagint, the translation of the Torah into Greek. Again, we'll talk about the issues that we find with that. Then Rome coming to the East Mediterranean in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE. Rome comes in, but they don't do anything. They just kind of hang out, and they support certain kingdoms so that they could gain favor. You have the Jewish, the prophets. Many of the prophets' books are organized. The Jewish Qumran community, they separate for God. And then you have the Seleucids, the king of Syria, who then comes to the Ptolemies. I'm sorry, I had misspoke. Seleucids are Syrians, so they're from the Levant. The Ptolemies are Egyptians who are from Egypt. They're both influenced by Hellenistic cultures. Then you have probably the most important thing that is not covered in our Bible, the Jewish Maccabean revolt in 166. Why does that happen? We're going to get into that. Then you have the Jewish autonomy under the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans are the ones who do the revolt in the 160s. They change temple practice. They change leadership in Judah. Then in 63, you have Rome. Rome comes in and they annex the land of Israel. But it's a client state. You are not a Roman subject. You are a Roman client. And it sounds odd, but it means two different things. You don't become a subject of Rome until about 6 BCE, between the last decade of before the Common Era. That's when Rome says enough is enough. We have a king. We're going to install him, but he is now going to be under us. So then you go from the king to praetorians, and you have Romans who are actually directly ruling Israel as opposed to a client king such as, I'm drawing a blank. Herod, thank you. So you have a revolt in the 60s of the Common Era. You have the fall of the Second Temple, which most historians believe the Romans did not intend to destroy the temple, kind of got out of hand. But I haven't studied enough of that period to give you a review. Correct. That's a faith-based argument. Correct. Providence. Yes, I agree. The temple falls, the first temple and the second temple fall on the same date, according to the Jewish calendar. So 45 to 150 CE, this is the information that the scholars have, is the compilation and the writings of the New Testament. It's not until the 1500s, after the Reformation, that we actually have a final authoritative settlement of canon. Maybe, because the Ethiopian Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, the ancient Eastern Orthodox, the Protestants, all have different canons. We have some basic books together, but we don't have any canons. And we are out of time, so I am going to leave it at that. Any quick questions before comments? I will say I don't anticipate that this class is going to be over by the end of the year. No. I want people to understand that there are different viewpoints and there are different understandings, but it's important, I think, to understand the people that we read about in the Bible. That's always been my passion, is to understand who they were as a human being. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Yes, I will have prints. I will put prints out on Wednesday afternoon, or for the Wednesday evening class for those of you who come for Wednesday, but it'll be available for Sunday, and then I will I'll let people in the back know, in the office know. I don't want to make that many copies for the church. I've got access to tons of paper. I don't want to use the church's paper like that. We get it by the truckloads on a regular. The courts seem to not like electronics, even though they say they want to go electronically. I'm an attorney, so I got plenty of paper. Thank you.